In a real-life traffic stop, everything happens fast. A single question from an officer can shift the entire direction of the moment, not because something wrong is happening, but because legal rights, if not understood clearly, can feel confusing under pressure. And in situations involving firearms, that pressure increases even more. What you say, how you say it, and even what you choose not to say can all become part of a legal record later. So here's the question. Do you think most people actually know how to properly respond when law enforcement asks about a firearm, or do you think confusion puts them at risk even when they are fully legal? Share your answer in the comments. Now let's be very clear from the beginning. This is not about avoiding the law. This is not about resisting authority. In my legal analysis, this is about understanding rights clearly, so lawful individuals do not accidentally create legal complications for themselves during routine encounters. Because the law does not just exist in courtrooms. It exists in real-time interactions, especially during traffic stops where communication matters as much as compliance. The foundation of this entire issue begins with the Second Amendment, which protects the right to keep and bear arms. However, as the Supreme Court has consistently explained, that right exists within a structured legal framework. In District of Columbia v. Heller, the court confirmed that individuals have the right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense. Later, McDonald v. City of Chicago extended that protection to state governments through the 14th Amendment. Then, in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, the court changed the legal test entirely, requiring that firearm regulations be consistent with historical tradition rather than modern balancing tests. In my legal analysis, this shift is important because it reinforces that the right to bear arms is constitutionally protected, but still subject to lawful regulation. Now, when law enforcement asks about a firearm during a traffic stop, the situation is not just about gun law. It is also about constitutional protections under the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Courts would likely examine whether any detention or search during a stop is based on specific facts rather than assumptions. The presence of a firearm alone does not automatically justify escalation, but it may become part of the overall context evaluated by courts. The Fifth Amendment protects against self-incrimination. However, in my legal analysis, it is important to understand that invoking rights and interacting respectfully with law enforcement are not contradictory. They operate together within lawful boundaries. Now let's talk about the legal reality during a stop. When an officer asks about a firearm, the question is typically part of ensuring safety and determining the situation. Different states may have different legal requirements about disclosure, permits, or notification. That means there is no single universal rule that applies identically everywhere. Courts would likely examine whether state requirements are clearly defined, consistently enforced, and communicated in a way that allows lawful gun owners to understand their obligations. There is a strong constitutional argument that individuals should not be placed in legal risk due to unclear or inconsistent application of rules during high-pressure encounters. At the same time, another perspective raised in court is that law enforcement must have clear protocols to ensure safety during traffic stops involving firearms. Both perspectives shape how laws are designed and interpreted. Now let's bring in real-world impact. For lawful gun owners, the most important factor during a traffic stop is clarity and calm communication. Misunderstandings often arise not from illegal behavior, but from unclear communication or uncertainty about local requirements. In my legal analysis, this is where many avoidable legal complications occur. Not because individuals intend to violate the law, but because they are unsure what is required in the moment. That is why understanding your rights beforehand matters so much. Now consider federal versus state law. Firearm possession is governed by both constitutional principles and state-level regulations. That means what is legally required during a traffic stop may differ depending on the jurisdiction. Some states require immediate notification to law enforcement if a firearm is present. Others do not impose that requirement unless specifically asked. This variation is legally significant, and courts would likely evaluate whether individuals had fair notice of those obligations. Now, from a legal analysis standpoint, one of the most important principles is this: rights must be both protected and understood in order to be effective. A right that exists in theory, but is not clearly understood in practice, can still lead to legal confusion during real-world situations. Supporters of stronger procedural clarity argue that both citizens and law enforcement benefit when rules are simple, consistent, and clearly communicated. They emphasize that predictable systems reduce misunderstandings and improve safety. On the other hand, supporters of broader discretionary authority argue that officers need flexibility in real-time situations to assess safety risks and respond appropriately based on context. Both perspectives are reflected in ongoing legal and policy discussions, and this is why Supreme Court precedent matters. Because every interaction like this ultimately sits within a constitutional framework shaped by cases like Heller, McDonald, and Bruin. These cases do not eliminate rules. They define the boundaries within which rules must operate. Now, before we continue, it is important to emphasize something clearly. In my legal analysis, knowing your rights is not about confrontation. It is about awareness, responsibility, and lawful conduct. The goal is not to escalate situations, but to navigate them correctly and respectfully. Because how a situation is handled in the moment can often matter as much as the law itself. So as we move forward into the next part, we will break down exactly what lawful communication looks like during a traffic stop, how courts view interactions involving firearms, and what practical steps can help reduce confusion without violating any legal or policy boundaries. Stay with me, because what comes next is where legal theory turns into real-world clarity that every responsible gun owner needs to understand. When we talk about what actually happens in a real traffic stop, the most important thing to understand is that courts do not evaluate the situation based on emotion or hindsight. They evaluate it based on reasonableness, clarity, and whether each person acted within the boundaries of the law at that exact moment. In my legal analysis, this is where communication becomes one of the most important legal tools an individual has. Because the law does not require confrontation, it requires clarity. Courts would likely examine whether an officer's questions were related to legitimate safety concerns, and whether the individual's responses were lawful, accurate, and consistent with applicable state requirements. That means context matters more than any single sentence or reaction. Now, let's be very precise about something important. When an officer asks about a firearm, there is no universal single-script response that applies in every jurisdiction. Laws vary between states, and the legal expectations during a stop depend on local statutes and case law. Some states require disclosure, while others do not impose that obligation unless specifically asked. In my legal analysis, this variation is one of the main reasons confusion exists in real-world encounters. Not because the law is unclear in principle, but because it is not uniform across all locations, and that is where responsibility becomes personal. Because regardless of jurisdiction, the safest and most legally sound approach is always lawful, calm, and respectful communication. Courts consistently look at whether interactions escalated unnecessarily or remained within reasonable bounds given the circumstances. The Fourth Amendment plays a role here again. Any detention or search must be reasonable under the law. Courts would likely examine whether the presence of a firearm created a legitimate safety concern or whether the situation was handled in a routine and proportionate manner. The Fifth Amendment also remains relevant in protecting individuals from being compelled into self-incriminating statements. But again, in my legal analysis, the exercise of rights must always be balanced with lawful cooperation during official encounters. Now, stepping back, it is important to understand the broader constitutional structure behind all of this. The Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms, but that right operates within a framework of regulations that are interpreted through Supreme Court precedent like Heller, McDonald, and Bruin. These cases do not eliminate government authority. They define its limits. And within those limits, states still maintain the ability to create procedural rules for safety, licensing, and law enforcement coordination. This is why outcomes in real life depend so heavily on location, context, and communication. Now let's talk about practical consequences. For lawful gun owners, the biggest risk during traffic stops is not illegal intent. It is misunderstanding how local law applies in that moment. A person may fully believe they are compliant, but differences between state rules can create unexpected complications if not clearly understood. In my legal analysis, this is where most avoidable legal issues occur. Not from wrongdoing, but from lack of updated legal awareness. That is why understanding your rights is only part of the equation. Understanding your responsibilities under current law is equally important. Supporters of strong constitutional protections emphasize that citizens should not feel uncertain or afraid when exercising lawful rights. They argue that clarity in law enforcement interactions builds trust and reduces unnecessary escalation. Supporters of structured regulation emphasize that clear procedures help ensure officer safety and public safety during unpredictable roadside situations. They argue that consistent protocols reduce ambiguity in high-pressure environments. Both perspectives influence how laws are shaped and applied. Looking at the political and legal reality, it is unlikely that traffic stop procedures involving firearms will become identical across all states in the near future. Instead, what we will likely see is continued refinement through court decisions, state-level clarification, and evolving law enforcement guidelines. In my legal analysis, this gradual evolution is normal in constitutional law. The system does not change overnight. It adjusts through interpretation and application over time. Now, as we reach the conclusion of this breakdown, one final point becomes clear. The law is not just about rights written in documents. It is about how those rights are understood, communicated, and applied in real-world situations where clarity matters most. And that is why awareness is essential. So as you reflect on this, consider one final question. Do you believe most misunderstandings during police encounters come from unclear laws themselves, or from a lack of awareness about how those laws apply in real situations? Share your thoughts in the comments. Civil discussion is the only way these complex issues become clearer for everyone. And if you want more fact-based, legally grounded explanations that break down real constitutional issues in a practical way, make sure to subscribe for future updates. Because at the end of the day, the law is not just something written in court opinions. It is something that becomes real the moment you are expected to understand it, apply it, and live by it with clarity, responsibility, and confidence.